You're a 12-year-old girl living in a peaceful Georgian village when armed men arrive at your door. They're not here for tribute or taxes. They're here for you. Your screams echo through the mountains as you're dragged away from everything you've ever known, destined for a fate that will strip away not just your freedom, but your very humanity. For over 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, controlling the destinies of millions. We celebrate its architectural marvels, its military prowess, its cultural achievements. But beneath the gilded domes and magnificent palaces lay sexual practices so systematically brutal that contemporary observers struggled to document them without horror. These weren't isolated incidents born from individual cruelty. They were deliberate policies, meticulously organized and ruthlessly implemented across generations. What you're about to discover comes from Ottoman administrative records, diplomatic correspondence, and survivor testimonies that reveal how an empire transformed human sexuality into an instrument of absolute control. The scale defies comprehension. We're talking about millions of lives destroyed across centuries through practices that turned children into commodities, women into inventory, and entire populations into hunting grounds for imperial pleasure. The Ottomans kept detailed records of everything, including the systematic procurement of children for sexual purposes, the operation of castration centers that killed 9 out of every 10 boys, and the management of human trafficking networks that spanned continents. But before we continue, if you're fascinated by the dark corners of history that textbooks won't touch, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us bring you more forbidden history. Now let's dive into the abyss. The foundation of Ottoman sexual exploitation rested on what they called the tribute system. But this wasn't about gold or grain. This was about human flesh, specifically the flesh of children. Every few years, Ottoman officials would conduct what they euphemistically termed collection expeditions through Christian territories in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. These weren't random raids. They were precisely calculated operations based on demographic surveys that tracked family compositions, birth rates, and previous collection quotas. The empire maintained spreadsheets of human misery, recording which villages had produced the most desirable children, and when those communities were due for their next harvest. The preferred targets were boys and girls between the ages of 8 and 15, though records show children as young as 5 being taken when they displayed exceptional beauty or intelligence. The selection process was clinical in its cruelty. Officials examined each child like livestock, checking teeth, muscle tone, facial symmetry, and what they called breeding potential. Parents who tried to hide their children faced immediate execution. Entire families were slaughtered as examples when villages attempted to resist the collections. The message was clear. Your children belong to the empire, and any attempt to protect them would result in the annihilation of everyone you love. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical violence. Children were forced to watch their parents tortured if they cried during the selection process. Siblings were deliberately separated to prevent any emotional support that might help them resist their new reality. The empire had perfected the art of breaking human spirits before the real exploitation even began. Once collected, these children entered a processing system that operated with industrial efficiency. They were immediately branded with Ottoman symbols, marking them as Imperial property. Their names were replaced with numbers that corresponded to detailed records tracking their origins, physical characteristics, and intended use. The most attractive children were destined for the imperial palaces, while those deemed less desirable were sold in slave markets that operated in every major Ottoman city. But even this classification system contained layers of horror that reveal the empire's sophisticated approach to sexual exploitation. Children designated for palace service underwent what Ottoman documents describe as preparation rituals. These involved forced conversions to Islam, intensive language training to erase their native tongues, and psychological conditioning designed to make them completely dependent on their captors for identity and purpose. The conversion process wasn't simply religious. It was a complete reconstruction of human consciousness. Children were taught that their previous lives had been lives of sin and ignorance, that their families were infidels deserving of conquest, that their new existence as sexual servants represented divine favor rather than enslavement. Those who resisted this indoctrination faced punishments that targeted their developing sexuality in particularly cruel ways. Boys might have parts of their genitalia mutilated as warnings. Girls could be subjected to procedures that would make future sexual experiences permanently painful. The empire understood that controlling sexuality meant controlling the entire person. The palace system itself represented the pinnacle of Ottoman sexual exploitation. The Sultan's household contained thousands of children and young adults whose entire existence revolved around providing sexual pleasure to their masters. This wasn't a harem in the romanticized sense that popular culture imagines. It was a sexual prison where human beings were reduced to living toys. The hierarchy within these palaces reflected the empire's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. The most favored sexual servants were given privileges that created fierce competition among the enslaved population. Children learned to betray each other for small advantages, destroying the natural bonds that might have provided emotional support. Those who pleased their masters could rise to positions of limited authority over newer arrivals, creating a system where victims became perpetrators in an endless cycle of abuse. The empire had discovered that the most effective way to maintain sexual slavery was to make the slaves complicit in enslaving others. The documentation that survives from this period reveals the bureaucratic nature of these sexual crimes. Palace administrators maintained detailed records of each child's sexual development, noting when they reached puberty, documenting their responses to different forms of abuse, and tracking their usefulness as they aged. When children grew too old for their master's preferences, they faced disposal through methods that ranged from sale to brothels to outright execution. The empire treated human beings as consumable resources, discarding them when their sexual utility expired. The scale of this system required constant replenishment through ever more aggressive collection campaigns. As word of Ottoman sexual practices spread, entire regions would attempt to flee rather than submit their children to imperial collectors. This resistance led to military campaigns designed not just for territorial conquest, but for human acquisition on a massive scale. The empire's expansion into Africa opened new sources of children for sexual exploitation. Ethiopian and Sudanese children were particularly prized for palace service, leading to trading relationships with local rulers who delivered human cargo in exchange for Ottoman military support. Calculated brutality, systematic annihilation, industrial-scale horror. These African children faced even more devastating treatment than their European counterparts. The empire categorized them not just by age and beauty, but by ethnic characteristics that determined their specific roles within the sexual hierarchy. Nubian children were considered ideal for certain forms of palace entertainment, while Ethiopian children were preferred for what Ottoman records describe as specialized services that modern observers can barely comprehend. The transportation of these children across thousands of miles created its own industry of suffering. Caravans specifically designed for human cargo moved constantly between Africa and Constantinople, with Ottoman officials maintaining way stations where children could be processed, examined, and prepared for their final destinations. The mortality rates during these journeys were staggering, with many children dying from disease, exhaustion, or deliberate elimination when they showed signs of resistance. What makes this trafficking network particularly horrifying is how it integrated with legitimate Ottoman commerce. The same trade routes that carried spices, silk, and precious metals also carried human cargo. Merchants who dealt in conventional goods would often supplement their profits by delivering children to imperial buyers. The empire had normalized human trafficking to such an extent that it became indistinguishable from ordinary business. The processing centers that received these children operated like factories of dehumanization. Each facility was designed to handle specific aspects of preparing children for sexual service. Some centers specialized in what Ottoman documents call physical modification procedures. Others focused on psychological conditioning. Still others managed the final assignment of children to their ultimate destinations. The empire maintained detailed medical records of these procedures, documenting not just what was done to each child, but how effectively different techniques achieved the desired results. They tracked which modification methods produced the most compliant servants, which psychological conditioning approaches eliminated resistance most efficiently, and which children showed the greatest potential for long-term usefulness. This systematic approach extended to the training programs that prepared children for palace service. These weren't simply instructional courses. They were comprehensive programs designed to strip away every trace of the child's original identity and replace it with whatever persona would best serve imperial needs. Children learn not just sexual techniques, but elaborate performance rituals that turned their abuse into entertainment for their masters. The empire created specialized schools where captured children were taught to sing, dance, and perform in ways specifically designed to enhance their sexual appeal. These institutions operated openly in major Ottoman cities, with their graduates proudly displayed in markets where buyers could evaluate their training and select the most accomplished performers. The psychological impact on children who survived these schools was devastating. They emerged as perfectly crafted instruments of pleasure, capable of anticipating and fulfilling their master's desires, while appearing to enjoy their own exploitation. The empire had succeeded in creating human beings who could convincingly perform enthusiasm for their own sexual slavery. But the palace system represented only one branch of Ottoman sexual exploitation. The empire also operated what historians now recognize as the world's first industrial-scale network of sexual entertainment venues. These weren't simple brothels. They were sophisticated establishments that catered to specific sexual preferences through carefully curated populations of enslaved performers. Different cities specialized in different types of sexual entertainment. Constantinople housed the empire's most exclusive venues, where wealthy patrons could access children and young adults trained in the most elaborate forms of sexual performance. Damascus became known for establishments that specialized in what Ottoman records describe as exotic practices involving both children and animals. Cairo developed a reputation for venues that offered what contemporary observers called the most degrading spectacles imaginable. The empire taxed these establishments like any other business, creating official records that document the systematic sexual exploitation of thousands of children and adults. These tax records still exist in Ottoman archives, providing undeniable evidence of state-sanctioned sexual commerce that operated on an unprecedented scale. The regulatory framework governing these venues reveals how thoroughly the empire had institutionalized sexual exploitation. Officials established standards for the treatment of enslaved performers, not to protect them, but to ensure their continued usefulness. Rules governed how frequently individual children could be used, what types of physical modification were permitted, and how establishments should dispose of performers who became too damaged to continue serving customers. The empire even created specialized courts that handled disputes related to sexual slavery. These courts adjudicated conflicts between buyers and sellers, resolved disagreements over the condition of enslaved individuals, and established legal precedents that defined human beings as property in increasingly specific ways. The Ottoman legal system had evolved to treat sexual exploitation not as a crime to be prevented, but as a commercial activity to be regulated. The international dimensions of this system reveal how Ottoman sexual practices influenced neighboring regions and trading partners. The empire exported both its techniques and its victims, establishing sexual slavery operations in territories far beyond its direct control. Local rulers who wanted to maintain good relations with Constantinople often adopted Ottoman practices, creating networks of sexual exploitation that spanned continents. The empire's diplomatic correspondence contains detailed discussions of sexual gifts exchanged between rulers. Children and young adults were routinely offered as diplomatic presents, with their selection and preparation handled by specialized imperial departments. These weren't casual exchanges. They were carefully calculated political transactions that used human sexuality as a tool of international relations. Forgotten victims, silenced suffering, institutional evil. The Ottoman Empire's systematic sexual exploitation represents one of history's most comprehensive examples of how power structures can weaponize human intimacy. For over 6 centuries, millions of children and adults were reduced to commodities in a machine designed to extract pleasure from human suffering. These weren't aberrations or cultural misunderstandings. They were deliberate policies that treated sexual violence as statecraft and human trafficking as economic strategy. The records are there, waiting in archives across former Ottoman territories. The archaeological evidence continues to emerge from excavation sites. The genetic legacy of these practices can still be traced in population studies spanning 3 continents. This history doesn't disappear because it makes us uncomfortable. Understanding these practices isn't about condemning modern populations, but about recognizing how institutional power can corrupt the most fundamental aspects of human experience. The millions of victims whose stories we've explored today deserve to have their suffering acknowledged, their humanity, stripped away by an empire that saw them as objects, must be restored through historical truth. The Ottoman Empire's sexual practices remind us that civilization is fragile, that systematic dehumanization can become normalized with terrifying ease, and that we must remain vigilant against any system that reduces human beings to instruments of others' pleasure. Their voices, silenced for centuries, finally demand to be heard.